don't even know what happened.
Oh, Jennifer, better excuses.
Dr. Brent.
Thank you, Anna. I'd like to move a little forward, please, Deputy Commissioner, to what happened in the aftermath of the arrival of additional resources. You make reference to some of the things that were done in terms of early on trying to establish a relationship with the community. And I think you said yesterday to Her Honour it's an ongoing process in terms of trying to re-establish a relationship of trust and collaboration.
Correct.
Right, now paragraph 98 and following.
Which?
First affidavit, Your Honour.
Yes.
Now, the first thing to be said, I think, and I know this is something you want to communicate to Her Honour, remarkable efforts were made by Senior ACPO Williams and also by his father.
That's correct.
That night.
Your Honour. Outstanding. I heard the evidence and I'm very impressed, and makes me proud that the actions he took as a member of the Northern Territory Police Force and as a cultural man from Yuendamu, he did an outstanding job to assist those on the ground.
Sorry, Your Honour,
And I commend him for it.
Yes, a bit louder,
Sorry,
please.
he did an amazing job, and I commend him for it.
Paragraph 101 and following, you speak of the transition in role for Acting Assistant Commissioner Worst, going from Operations Commander to being the Senior Executive member responsible for providing community engagement. Now, translating that into action, Rumman words, he and the Acting Commissioner, then Mr Murphy, both flew out to Yuendamu the next day. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you describe in paragraph 103 the various meetings and communications that Assistant Commissioner Worst engaged in. And then Mr Murphy joined him, and in due course there was the bigger meeting to which we've made reference already. Now, looking back, what do you say about the attempts to engage after the tragic events of the night before?
In my view, Your Honour, I think senior police took steps to start the first part of that process that still continues to this day to rebuild community trust in the Northern Territory Police Force, and I think their steps were appropriate.
You describe a small meeting at the Yuendamu Police Station involving Assistant Commissioner Worst, which allowed questions to be answered, and then of course the establishment of a sorry camp, and it was on the 12th of November that the new Police Commissioner, Mr Chalker, came to Yuendamu as really one of his first responsibilities as Commissioner of Police in the Northern Territory. Is that right?
As I understand it, that's correct, yes.
And he met with members of WIDAC, and a cleansing ceremony took place in his presence, I think, involving a large percentage of the community.
I'm informed that's correct, yes.
And there was something of a further component of that in Her Honour's presence that took place when we were all present at the community. There was a communication you describe in paragraph 115 between Mr Worst and members at the station, and you describe that as trying to ensure that members understood their cultural responsibilities. Can you say a little bit more about what you understand to have taken place in terms of not making any more errors and ensuring that the community was allowed to go about its sorry business without disturbance from police?
Your Honour, I'm informed, as per my affidavit, that those steps, as outlined, were culturally appropriate, and they were designed by senior police through their relationships, previous and existing relationships with senior elders at Yuendamu, to try and allow an opportunity to commence that first build back of trust that could be and was eroded following the shooting. I think it was appropriate that those officers got briefed what they can do, where they go, how they should perform, how they should act.
Sergeant Jolly was prevailed upon to return to Yuendamu, and why was that?
Sergeant Jolly's got long-standing connections with Yuendamu. He's a respected member of the Northern Territory Police Force and was a person considered to be the most appropriate to help lead that, rebuild that trust in the community.
In paragraphs 119 and following, you describe the attempts to communicate with community elders, such as Robin Granitz and others, about the sensitive task of completing the criminal investigation.
Correct.
What do you say about the efforts that were made to speak with and solicit cooperation from senior members of the Yuendamu community so that the task could be done both to undertake the criminal investigation and also to secure evidence needed by Her Honour for her investigation?
Yes, Your Honour, in my view it was appropriate, commensurate. I'm sure there was numerous difficulties at the start of it, but it was a commencement pathway that we could work collaboratively with the community to get the best possible evidence for both the investigation that needed to take place into the circumstance surrounding the death of Kumanjayi Walker.
And the community generously and collaboratively constituted Paramparoo and facilitated the two investigations. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, let's deal with the two investigations, the criminal and coronial investigations. I only propose to do this briefly with you, and if others want to ask more about it, they can. But have you reviewed the criminal and coronial investigations in order to reflect upon whether they seem to have been contributed to and undertaken properly by the Northern Territory Police?
I have.
And senior personnel from whom Her Honour has heard undertook those. They had differences of perspective from time to time, is that right?
Yes.
Is that surprising?
No, not at all.
Are you satisfied with the quality of the criminal investigation first up?
Yes, I am.
Now, there have been some reservations from time to time expressed by persons about the criminal investigation and about the relationship with the coronial investigation. But when one reaches the bottom line, are you satisfied with the information which Northern Territory Police Force has been able to assist Her Honour with and have provided to Her Honour?
Yes, I am, and ultimately, Your Honour, I think, as you see before you, thousands and thousands of pages of evidence and documents prepared in a logical, albeit time-consuming methodology. I think it's been comprehensive, thorough. I have no concerns.
Has it been your instruction, and also that of Deputy Commissioner Murphy, that there be full cooperation with this coronial investigation?
Absolutely, Your Honour.
And to your knowledge, has that taken place?
Yes, Your Honour. I hope every single member of the Northern Territory Police Force that appears before this inquest does so in the spirit of what is intended and in obligation with the duty of their office.
Now, being entirely straightforward with Her Honour, there were some persons who were not as quick as might have been desirable to provide their statements, is that right?
Correct.
But ultimately, those statements were provided, and where necessary, appropriate instructions were given that they be provided.
Yes.
Right. I'd like to move to a different topic altogether, which is Mr. Rolfe, because while the inquest is not about him, there are issues which have been raised in relation to his recruitment and his training and similar. Now, would you mind turning to, first of all, paragraph 237 of the first affidavit?
Yes.
You say something positive about the training of Northern Territory Police members, but perhaps more importantly, there is a review from time to time of the content and focus of training, is there not?
Yes.
And has there been a particular review in the aftermath of Kumanjayi Walker's passing?
Yes.
And you identify in paragraph 237 4 areas where it was identified that there needed to be improvements. Could you say a little to Her Honour about those 4 areas, please, starting with the first one?
Your Honour, the first identified opportunity was non-compliance with legislation, policy, procedure and practice, in particular the adherence to the 10 principles, operational safety principles we talked about, and I sense here elements of command and control, decision making and risk assessment that could be improved.
I'm going to stop you there. A number of those issues to do with the operational safety principles and our sense here were identified arising out of the various incidents in which Mr. Rolfe was involved prior to you entering. Is that right?
Correct.
And the review of those various incidents, about which Your Honour, Mr. Porter will give you evidence later this week, identified that there was not adequate compliance with or implementation of the operational safety principles, or our sense here. Is that right?
Yes.
And has that made the force reflect further on what needs to be done to make sure that those important principles are better understood and, more importantly, are implemented?
Yes.
A lot of that is to do with thinking about risk options, or risk principles and options, for instance, for taking people into custody, or how efforts should be made to apprehend people. Is that right?
Correct.
So we'll go into what's been done in due course. So command and control, decision-making, risk assessment, you've talked about that. And the last 2, please?
The need to improve to system to monitor performance of members of previous military or law enforcement experience, to ensure that our training is primacy and there's no confusion between other training modules.
Let's think about that a little bit more, please, because reservations have been expressed by representatives of the Committee on Instructions about former members of the military being serving members in remote communities. And is that something that has been thought about by the Northern Territory Police Force since it was raised here?
Yes, it has.
We'll go into it a little bit more, but are changes being made to training to ensure that persons from such backgrounds reflect upon the culture with which they have been inculcated in defence of Australia, including overseas, as against what is expected of them from Northern Territory Police Force?
Correct. Again, Your Honour, to drive the primacy of police training, Northern Territory police training is the primacy for their response.
Without being exhaustive about it, what are some of the differences that have been identified between what one expects of one of our armed services and what's expected of a member of the Northern Territory Police Force?
Primarily, I'm not a former member of the ADF, Your Honour, but primarily tactics deployed in a war zone or a hostile operating environment such as a war zone are fundamentally different to those that we would employ in peacetime Australia operationally. They include weapons, different types of weapons, they include our clothing, they include our vehicles, they include our communications, they include a whole raft of factors that are fundamentally different.
I want to focus, if I could, with you, Deputy Commissioner, on attitudes, because the training of members of the armed services is rigorous, and it helps to protect us, and importantly, it helps them to do their job when they're deployed elsewhere. And there are values and approaches to what they do in order to stay alive and in order to fulfil their objectives as, for instance, members of the army. And those are different to what needs to be done when a search is being done at Walbury Camp, or a person who has stolen something needs to be apprehended, or when someone who's been domestically violent needs to be taken into custody. How do you deacculturate people from what keeps them alive in the army to what's required of them, with all the checks and balances and expectations of a member of the police force?
Very good question, Dr. Freckleton. I think
You need to give the good answer now.
Thank you very much for that challenge. Your Honour, I think it is a challenge for anybody, and I think at the heart of that is the culture of our policing model, to be brutally honest, that we operate in a community-focused environment. We're not on patrol in a war zone. We are patrolling our people. We're policing our people for protection, for community safety. It's a fundamental significant difference in how we go about what we do.
How do you communicate that altogether different emphasis and set of objectives to people who've served us in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere?
So moving into the future, Assistant Commissioner Porter will be able to give you some clarity around what we propose to do in terms of getting ADF members to be more ex-ADF members who are members of the Northern Territory Police Force, to help us shape some sort of definitive program that allows it, because it's not cut and dry, Your Honour. I think we have many fantastic police officers who are ex-members of the ADF, who served not only their country with great distinction, but now the Northern Territory. So I don't believe it's a simple cut across between two, that there's a fundamental problem that you're a former member of the ADF and you can't become a police officer. I don't believe that at all. I think the issue is just ensuring that there's no confusion between what was their role, perhaps in a militarised sense, and what we do as police officers. Whilst as police officers we have a command and control structure, we have uniforms and ranks, I don't think it is as rigid and as prescriptive perhaps as what maybe the soldiers operate under in the army, for example. And I'm sure it differs between the services.
In the order of a quarter of the persons who are being recruited to the Northern Territory Police Force have a defence background, is that right?
Yes, that's
or have
correct.
done in recent years anyway.
That's correct, Your Honour.
What are the advantages of employing those persons?
Generically speaking, Your Honour, I think they come with a number of significant advantages. Exposure to discipline, understanding of a requirement around ranks, structure, generally, in my experience, a sense of duty, which is difficult to articulate and a thing, but a duty. I want to serve, I want to improve, I want to make it better for people. I think that's a fundamental concept that transposes well between the ADF and what we do as police officers. I think that general sense, we want to make a difference, we want to make things better. Training is somewhat differently, but I think there's a sense of camaraderie, I think there's a sense of belonging. I think those things that come from between uniform service, perhaps, might be a word I could use, that translate across between the ADF and Northern Territory Police Force and other police forces.
Would you mind turning to paragraph 32 and following of your second affidavit? You give a statistical breakdown of ex-ADF members being taken into the force, but what I'd like to ask you about is what you say in paragraph 34. You say 293 former ADF members during the 2016 to 18 period applied to join the force, but only 47 were given letters of offer. Can you say anything more to Her Honour about the processes which lead to, one in about 6 being successful in their applications.
Again, Your Honour, I suspect you can get far greater clarity from Assistant Commissioner Bruce Porter, but to touch upon it, I think there are probably a number of factors that may affect why there's a disparity between those who apply and those that are accepted. The vacancy rate might be one, the number of people seeking at any particular time, and the number of people that are applying could be varied between police forces. I think there is potentially psychological assessment that's undertaken through the recruitment process that may preclude some people, regardless of ADF service or not, whether they may or may not be suitable for employment as a police officer. A number of factors, Dr. Frickland, that could influence that number.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to what you have been able to identify by analyses of use of force by former ADF members. And for that purpose, would you mind turning to paragraph 214 of your third affidavit? Now, while you're doing that, I'll set the context. You may recall that Mr. Proctor raised some issues in terms of whether more force has been utilised by former ADF members than by non-ADF members. In your second affidavit, you identified that anecdotally that did not seem to be right, but on the basis of the issue raised by Commander Proctor, it's been looked into further. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, let's go through this carefully, starting with paragraph 217, please. An analysis has been done by you and your staff about the persons utilising use of force more than others. Now, is the use of force presentation, which is documented every time, isn't it, or it's supposed to be anyway?
Correct.
Yeah. Is that of itself an indicator as to whether somebody is using force more than they ought to be?
Your Honour, the data would, Mr. Freckland's made the point, the data is generally reflective that it reflects that the police force consists of 27 to 30% of our ex-ADF members. So the fact that the corresponding number of forms is generally consistent with the number of ex-ADF members we have on board anyway. But the use of force isn't of itself reporting is not necessarily an accurate friend that there's been excessive force or any force applied, because the reporting guidelines dictate when we would submit a use of force report. For example, where you actually haven't used any force, you've just drawn a weapon, or you've drawn your taser, or you've carried a firearm, deployed a dog. You've heard some of those examples. They get recorded as a use of force report for statistical recording and analysis, but there's not necessarily been any use of force applied. There is also the data, and unfortunately the ability for us to collect in any meaningful way doesn't necessarily reflect upon where the member or the individual officer is located or attached. And, for example, Your Honour, deputy commissioners don't use a lot of use of force when compared to a constable who are frontline operational police officers. So depending what area of the police force, use of force can be a great indicator in certain areas, but it's not a surprise that administrative areas don't have a high use of force. School-based police officers, there's a whole raft of functions performed by police officers in that. So, you know, a number of frontline operational police officers are more likely to have a higher use of force than some other. So the data and the analysis has been quite problematic to pull together to ensure that we can actually make some meaningful assessments of what use of force truly means when it's other than just a statistic on a bit of paper.
The analysis that's been done by Northern Territory Police has identified, and I'm stand to be corrected by my friend, Mr. Officer, if I get this wrong, but I think 46 instances of use of force by Mr. Rolfe over the period before you intervened. So, and that's over approximately 3 years.
If that's the number, Doctor, I can't recall. Off the top of my head.
I think that's right, and Mr. Officer will tell me if I've got that wrong. That's in the order of 15 a year, and he was stationed mostly in Alice Springs. Is
Yes.
there an inference to be drawn on the basis of that?
Again, I think no. I think that the data was clear in terms that he didn't appear in the top numbers of use of force by members, and of those use of force that have now received some detailed scrutiny, most of which, as I understand, didn't result in any further action needed to be taken at a disciplinary level, at least. So
I'm hearing you say there's a distinction to be drawn between use of force raw data and established determinations that excessive use of force has been used by a member.
correct. So yeah, a use of force report does not mean that you've used excessive force.
Right.
It means you've recorded the use of force inappropriate in accordance with our general order of practice and procedure, but it doesn't necessarily follow suit just because you've put a use of force report in that it was disproportionate, unlawful, unnecessary.
On the basis of the data which the force does have and the interrogation which has been undertaken as best it can be, have you identified any indication that former ADF personnel are either using more force or using excessive force
No,
more
Your Honour.
than non-ADF personnel?
No, Your Honour.
I'd like to ask you some questions about recruiting processes, please. And for that purpose, would you mind turning to paragraph 208 of your first affidavit? Which we'll go a little bit further back to 194. You identified there that there were some issues in relation to information provided by Constable Rolfe, and you give 3 instances. Could you speak to each of those briefly in turn, please?
Your Honour.
Starting with his answer to the question, have you previously applied to join any other force?
Have you put in which is he in his application to join the Northern Territory Police Force, he crossed out the yes box
Now, why does that matter?
because he had previously applied.
194. All right. What's the issue that arises from that, Deputy Commissioner?
Well, I think with all jurisdictions in an active recruiting campaign, certainly we'd like to know if he's likely to be accepted, if another police force has accepted someone or refused somebody. I think they're really relevant to whether we should accept or reject an applicant. I think it's a very appropriate question to ask. And I know every police force in Australia would be asking similar questions.
What's the significance or otherwise of his having answered incorrectly?
Well, I think in this instance it relates to his rejection by the Queensland Police, and otherwise further inquiries may be made by the Northern Territory Police Force to identify why.
Yeah. And again, he's given an incorrect impression by his answer. Is that relevant to recruitment criteria?
It does, in terms of it strikes at the heart of the honesty and of the applicant. First step.
How important is honesty as a criterion for employment of a person as a Northern Territory police officer?
Well, in my view, it's absolutely critical.
Let's go to the second one then. This is the public nuisance issue.
Yes. Failed to disclose that he had received a fine for public nuisance, violent behaviour issued by the Queensland Police.
Now, to his credit, he did disclose this in the interview process, but he didn't disclose it in his initial communications. What's the issue there?
Well, again, I think if it had been documented more thoroughly at that particular moment in the recruitment process, it probably he wouldn't have progressed to the next phase.
So the third issue, he failed to disclose having been convicted of theft. It was a minor theft, but nonetheless it was from a colleague in the military. and he was called to account for that and asked specifically about it, and he didn't communicate that. What's the significance of that?
I think it, again, as we've discussed previously, Your Honour, I think it strikes at the heart of the application process and who we're trying to recruit. It's a dishonesty offence. I think it would have a significant impact on his progression through to the next phase of the recruitment process.
Now, as you describe in paragraph 201 and following, there were difficulties in terms of gaining access to ADF service records at the relevant time, and that meant that generally ADF records were not being obtained by those undertaking the recruiting assessments. Is that right?
Correct.
Now that's a significant deficiency, given that you're drawing the order of a quarter of your membership from the ADF, is it not?
Well, it was.
It was, exactly. Has that been addressed now?
It has, Your Honour.
Could you explain that to Her Honour, please?
Well, we now filled that void, and we seek that information prior to progressing to final selection process.
And if the ADF is slow in providing that information, what happens?
Well, they don't progress.
All right. And generally speaking, is the ADF cooperating in providing that?
Yes, they are, Your Honour. I think, as I've discussed, you know, we have lots of former members of the ADF who are outstanding members of the police force.
And you describe that at paragraph 218 and following of this affidavit. Through the Joint Military Police Unit, those improvements have been made.
Yes, Your Honour.
All right. Now, Her Honour has heard evidence, which I'm only going to take you to very briefly, in terms of the involvement of a psychologist in the process, and you describe at 209 and following the organisation that was being used. Going to what that expert communicated to the force, you detail above average aggression score, less likely than others to accept responsibility after making a mistake. Prediction ranking, above average to excellent overall, potential of suitability, excellent potential. There are some issues sitting within those results, are there not? Especially the first one in terms of the aggression score.
Yeah, I would have thought they would have triggered some questioning by interviewers what it means.
What is your understanding of whether those kinds of signs are being followed up on more assertively now?
I think this whole process has highlighted our ability that we could have done and should be doing, and we are doing that recruitment process much more rigorously. So I think it was a great learning, and we've closed that gap.
And you explained the new organisation Tallagy in paragraph 223 and following.
Yes.
They use a pre-employment psychological testing process. Is the force satisfied with the assistance being provided by Tallagy?
Yes.
At paragraph 213, you say that there are limits to what can be achieved by the recruitment process in identifying unsuitable applicants. What did you mean by that?
I think that's an identification that the Northern Territory Police Force, like every other employer, are fallible in terms of what we're told, based upon the honesty and veracity of our processes and people that apply. I don't think there's a bulletproof system anywhere in Australia that will absolutely guarantee. There's lots of gaps between information sharing, between systems across jurisdictions about a variety of matters. Some may be minor criminal matters, some may be traffic matters, a whole raft of issues. And there's no unique one model that I'm aware of that has solved every one of those potential to close the gaps.
Now, amongst the checks and balances of the recruiting process is the following up of references. Do you recall that?
Correct.
And in this instance, those are undertaking that process, made contact with a solicitor's firm, which was, I'm going to put this tactfully, which may not have been in the best position to be entirely independent in its provision of a reference. Is that right?
Correct.
Well, now, what's been done to address the need for arm's length independent provision of references rather than ones which might be regarded as influenced by connection or not wholly independent?
So there's provision of a statement that we seek from those referees to acknowledge if there's any potential conflict of interest or relationship issues that not overtly apparent with the paperwork that's attached.
Thank you. And is that, I'll just ask you to turn, if you don't mind, to the third of your affidavits and to paragraph 401. Thank you.
Yes.
That covers the issue that we've just been discussing. Is 402 the new referee report template which endeavours to address that issue?
Correct, Your Honour. The new template includes the following. With you providing this referee check for blank, the named person, could there be any conflicts of interest in doing so? For example, do you know them personally, close friends, partner, family member, or another some type of relationship? Just to give some clarity around the referee, how they know the applicant may assist decision makers further down through the process.
Now, you identify in the paragraphs immediately after that, starting 404, that Constable Rolfe had received a fine in Queensland, but it didn't show up on the national police check or the probity checks undertaken because there are limits to what is disclosed by those checks. Traffic matters, for instance, do not show up, and nor it would appear do fines for minor infractions of community behaviour, public order offences of a low order.
Yeah, that's correct, Your Honour. And it's a significant national issue, obviously not just in relation to recruitment, but certainly with the ability of police forces across the nation to know what people coming into each jurisdiction have. So it's still not been resolved.
However, if these matters emerge by what should be a self-disclosure or by the process of inquiry or discussion with the applicant, you say that there is a change of approach expected of those in the recruiting area, as of paragraph 409.
Well, again, it's outlined in that paragraph, Your Honour, but it talks about the ability and it should be explored with the applicant during their interview. And members of the interview panel can take further steps if they are at any time concerned about the veracity of information provided to them. And I think it reflects back on to the earlier conversations we had where the primary focus on individual applicants to disclose for full frankness and honesty everything they know about themselves that may affect their ability to employ them.
And has the time pressure been explicitly removed, and do you refer to this in 410, so that investigations of any kind can be undertaken regardless of how long it takes, really?
Yeah, agreed, yes, crucial.
So is this a required change of culture and priorities that has been communicated to those undertaking recruitment of applicants to the force?
Yes.
Corona has heard a great deal about messages that have been engaged in by Mr. Rolfe and by persons known to Mr. Rolfe, including within the Northern Territory Police Force. You've described those messages yourself in a variety of ways. in particular in paragraph 57 of your third affidavit, where you've called them unacceptable, not reflective of culture. And you also, thank you, you also described them as reprehensible, offensive and ill-disciplined.
That's correct.
Is there any ambiguity about whether the references that particularly Dr. Dwyer has taken a number of references to, in terms of there being racist, sexist, homophobic, disrespectful of authority?
No, I don't think so. I think my words are clear.
What's your personal reaction to reading this?
Confronting, disappointing, disturbed.
Putting it in reasonably mild language, is your own gut reaction a bit stronger than that?
You asked that question. Yeah,
Hello, all right. You said they're not consistent with the values to be expected of members of the police force. What do you mean by that?
Well, they're just totally unacceptable and don't reflect the values of the police force. I mean, I think I've been clear, concise. It's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
We don't tolerate it.
What don't you tolerate?
Those unacceptable types of reference and language that's been reflected in those text messages, Your Honour. I think they were very reprehensible conduct.
Is that a general set of attitudes and behaviours within your police force, Deputy Commissioner?
From my experience, Your Honour, no, it's not. I mean, from my exposure, no, it's not. It's not something that I see broadly across, even on the disciplinary matters that I'm aware of that come across my desk, Your Honour, when they come. And it also reflected language that, quite bluntly, I haven't heard 30 years.
I want to interrogate this further with you, because Her Honour has a number of text messages. They include Mr. Rolfe, to be sure, but a variety of other persons, including at sergeant level.
Yeah.
And no one would have known about this but for the circumstances of Mr. Rolfe's phone being downloaded and identified as for the purposes of proceedings. And so we now know that there is at least a cohort of people who are utterly racist, sexist, homophobic, contemptuous of remote policing and disrespectful of persons such as yourself.
Correct.
How do you know that that's not a general and prevalent attitude within your force, given you didn't know about this group until the serendipitous discovery of these messages?
In my exposure through the Northern Territory Police Force, I come into contact with lots and lots of people, not just police officers or police members. I come into contact with a broad sector of the community, Aboriginal communities, other community members. I get a sense, in my view, of what I see when it's confronted. Now, I accept the fact that constables are highly unlikely to be, or any rank are highly likely to going to sit in front of me and use that type of terminology and language. But again, if it was prevalent and everywhere, it would be much more visible to our supervisors, sergeants, senior sergeants, and I would anticipate would have resulted in a lot more action being taken if it was called out. I mean, my belief, my fervent belief is, I sit here, Your Honour, with a Northern Territory Police uniform on. I swore an oath when I took this role. I hold that oath very close to my heart. I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't tolerate to be a member of this agency if I honestly believed that we held these deep-seated racist views. I would terminate my commission and leave. It's not what I've seen from the broad spectrum of people that I know. However, I accept from what I read and what I saw that there are people who do use those communications, and it's not acceptable, and it never will be acceptable. I don't know.
Most of those messages involve people at Alice Springs Station.
Yes.
At the very least, one can say that there has been a cohort of people with these kinds of views and attitudes that they were hiding from others, but which they ventilated in what they thought was a private context in text messages. So what have you, as a Deputy Commissioner, done to deal with the issue which has been identified unequivocally at Alice Springs?
Well, certainly in respect to Alice Springs specifically,
Yes.
we have done some, and quite a lot, I think, efforts, and again, identified within my affidavit a whole significant amount of work we've done, particularly around cultural reform. And at the heart of cultural reform, in my view, is our deep-seated value and belief systems around what's acceptable and not acceptable. So specifically at Alice Springs, following clearly the evidence that's been heard before this inquest, basic things like relocation of our supervisors, our watch commanders and our officers in charge from other locations in the North Alice Springs Police to be back on the floor. Your Honour, I've heard the evidence of Bradley Wallace, who gave really impassioned evidence before this inquest, and he talked about what he sees on the floor here, much closer to the action, unfortunately, than I get, and he didn't highlight to this inquest that it's widespread and endemic at the Alice Springs Police Station. When I look at the context of those that received those text messages, Patrol Group number 5 of that era in 2019, they were primarily the people who received and were involved in the text messages. Most of those people no longer are here in Alice Springs, I would suggest all of them, and there's been significant change to the leadership at Alice Springs. A lot, in my view, Your Honour, has been done to address at least the perception that there is this widespread, where just this week, Your Honour, Monday, there was a smoking ceremony and cultural induction training again at Alice Springs for the new recruits that have just turned up. There are ongoing conversations with sergeants and senior sergeants about acceptable standards of behaviour, what's accepted. Where issues are identified, we take firm action.
Let's go through some of the things to which you refer in your affidavit, please. Because at 62 you say in writing what you've just said orally to Her Honour, and then you make reference to meetings with senior sergeants. Could you explain that further, please?
Your Honour, in my affidavit, identify specifically, I think I've identified 11. There could be 111 over my journey here, but certainly the first thing was the Commissioner of Police, Jamie Chalker, APM, Deputy Commissioner Michael Murphy and myself have met with every member of the Northern Territory Police Force above the rank and including the rank of Senior Sergeant through to Assistant Commissioner. We held a series of workshops and we met personally with every member for at least half an hour.
Give Her Honour an account, please, of what those interactions were like. Were they just asking people for feedback and how they were going in the force and whether they'd like to be promoted, or did they address some of these sorts of issues?
They addressed at the heart of what this whole process, in my mind, is trying to identify to you, Your Honour, is about our cultural reform, the leadership we expect.
So how did you do that?
Personally, face to face.
What did you say to them? What did you
We addressed through a workshop process the Project 2030 Back to Basics Commissioner strategy and our strategy about for the future direction of the Northern Territory Police Force. That was the first process, and so they had an awareness and understanding of what the future looked like going forward in terms of our strategy. We had conversations at a broad level with the group around leadership expectations, and that was followed then with a one-on-one conversation with every member that we've identified, where we sat down and we had a conversation, a heart-to-heart conversation about what the Northern Territory Police Force expected, what we expected, and we sought engagement from each one of those members, what they could deliver back to us and how we would improve, because we knew coming that this sort of behaviour was just totally unacceptable.
Now, you must have got some good responses and some poorer responses from some of them. Can you give Her Honour a flavour of how those meetings went when you broached those kinds of issues and tried to draw them out to get an idea of whether they might be sympathisers with racism, sexism, and so on?
Your Honour, though, again, I'm trying to couch this in terms that you can appreciate, but in my 44 years as a police officer, I've never been involved with anything as powerful as that. The ability to sit down with the senior executive of the police force is almost nigh impossible in any other jurisdiction. But we made the effort and we sat down and we looked every one of those people in the eye and we talked about this. And I'm not going to disclose every conversation because I haven't got my records in front of me, but I can assure this forum and the Northern Territory Police Force that may be listening, everyone listened closely. There were tears in that room from various people. It was very, very deep and meaningful about expectations and what role they could provide to provide future leadership for the Northern Territory Police Force. It wasn't a one-way street. And lots of people sat in that room and looked at us and thought, I can do better. And lots of people said things to us that we took away that maybe we could do better. So it was a great, powerful opportunity to reflect the cultural values of the Northern Territory Police Force as we expect it and demand it to be.
Now, you've explained what's been done with senior sergeants, superintendents and commanders. Have you engaged in, or are you starting to engage in a comparable process with the 195 sergeants in the force?
The Commissioner of Police is personally speaking to every officer of the rank of sergeant and above. He's commenced that process as of this year. He's unfortunately only done 23 so far, but his aim is that he will personally speak to every Northern Territory Police officer of the rank of sergeant and have the same conversation again around expectation, leadership, cultural values, what we expect, what can we do, collaboration, well-being, strategies we're doing.
You refer in paragraph 66 and 67 to broadcasts in respect of these matters. Is that an attempt to reinforce the message in writing?
It is, Your Honour. Again, it's an official broadcast to the membership, reinforcing the expectations and reminding them of their responsibility under the Northern Territory Police Force Code of Conduct, and that if there's breaches of it, we would consider it to be a serious breach of discipline.
In paragraph 68 to 70, you refer to incorporation of these issues into the promotional process. How's that been done?
Your Honour, I think this, again, links very closely to the heart of cultural reform that we've talked about. I personally, until my time for the 3 months I was down here for the inquest, have sat on every promotional panel from the rank of senior sergeant through to assistant commissioner. I haven't got the data in front of us, but I've personally invested a significant portion of my time in the Northern Territory to that process. And when we interview people, we take the questions we ask of our potential leaders for the Northern Territory Police Force, and we ask them specific questions around leadership, about culture, about reform, about governance, about accountability, about all the things that we've talked about here, now incorporated in our questioning and interview process of every single applicant from the rank of senior sergeant above. And in my journey here, it has been significant, the difference I see between what people told us in 2020 to what I'm getting told in 2023. There seems to be a very large uptake, and a number of people, we've promoted a significant number of people who clearly can articulate and demonstrate the cultural needs and the reform of the Northern Territory Police Force. I think it's been very powerful. Those questions are specific. Explain to us what I can't give you the word for it, but around cultural change, leadership, continuous improvement. What are you going to do? What would you do if you're confronted? If you're the officer in charge of Alice Springs Police Station and something's happened, what will you do about it? There's been a number of those direct questions that significantly, across a broad sector for the dozens and dozens of interviews we've done, I'm sure every applicant for promotion knows what the senior executive are expecting of our future leaders.
Is it your perspective that there were deficiencies in leadership, in particular in Alice Springs, in relation to these kinds of issues from supervisors?
When I heard the evidence, Your Honour, in here of a supervisor of the Alice Springs Police Station who's involved in sending text messages and other behaviour we heard in here, it concerns me greatly.
And so is this the reason for the focus on enhancement of leadership skills and assumption of responsibility in relation to response to racist, misogynistic, disrespectful, homophobic and sexist language?
I think that's one element of it, yes, Dr. Frick, but Your Honour, it goes deeper than that. I think it actually goes to the heart of policing, what style of police we want, and the absolute necessity for things such as governance and accountability. It's broader than just one dimension, and I think it's a requirement of any contemporary modern police force that those values are driven hard.
In paragraph 71, you refer to the utilisation of the Australian Institute of Police Management to run leadership training for sergeants. Why are you particularly focusing on sergeants and senior sergeants?
Sergeants and senior sergeants, Your Honour, are the backbone of the Northern Territory Police Force and any police force. They're our frontline leaders. They're the people, the men and women who have to use their discretion, have to use all the complexities of things we've discussed in here to address the issues that we're currently talking about. They have to have the courage of conviction. They have to have the ability to navigate complex and difficult pathways, and we demand a great deal of those particular ranks, and we are trying and committed to coming up with better training modules so we get people appropriately skilled to be able to do the role that we demand of them.
If I described those ranks as the transmitters of culture, would you agree?
Yes, I would.
So you described the AIPM course that's been run in October last year and a series of further courses during this year, is that right?
That's correct, Your Honour. And I had the opportunity to speak to both the AIPM, Australian Institute of Police Management lecturers who provided the course, and to participants on that course, and we're going to be rolling them out today. And the feedback we got was glowing in terms of eye-opening, things that really challenge their thinking, and it is absolutely fundamental for the Northern Territory Police Force going forward. We're going to be driving that throughout the rest ongoing time in the Northern Territory, my time here.
Moving to paragraph 72, you've described to Her Honour then the AIPM course. Your own college is rolling out a sergeant development course mandatory for all substantive and remote sergeants, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, in order to be in charge of a remote station, is a person made a remote sergeant rather than a substantive one?
Correct.
So by this college course, you're capturing both the substantive sergeants and also those who have this important responsibility in charge of what might only be 2 or 3 man stations, is that right?
That's correct, Your Honour.
Right, and just tell Her Honour a little bit more about that. It's programmed to commence in the middle of this year, and you outline in that third sentence a range of issues which it is targeting. Can you tell Her Honour a bit more about some of those particular issues?
So Your Honour, if you read my affidavit, the course is technically focused on some of the key technical responsibilities of the rank of sergeant or remote sergeant, and as outlined, again, we talk about SMEAC principles, the delivery of briefings, culture, discipline, domestic violence, really all of the things that we expect a sergeant to be capable of delivering in the field in the Northern Territory. And I think there's been, all we consider is just an absolute necessity to address what we see as perhaps a bit of a void in that area. We want to make sure that our sergeants, particularly the rank of sergeant, they are the most important, or senior sergeant, most important ranks out there, have got this deeper knowledge and understanding of how they perform their duties.
And is the plan, as you described in 73, when this sergeant development course is bedded down, to extend it to more senior ranks?
We'll amend it to include the rank of senior sergeant. It'll be amended more commensurate with the rank of senior sergeant. So, yeah, absolutely.
Now, the 8th matter you've referred to already, you've got down the superintendents from the 2nd floor at the Alice Springs Police Station onto the muster room floor to have more contact with members and to influence how people are interacting.
Senior sergeants, Your Honour. Senior sergeants. So previously the officer in charge was on the 2nd floor and the watch commander was in a different location. We've relocated them to be on the muster room floor, and I think Your Honour's heard evidence from a number of witnesses who talk about that when that senior leadership was on the floor, banter, was capable of being heard and witnessed by senior members who could pull it up. I think we heard evidence, Your Honour, of superintendents. They didn't say that sort of thing when the superintendent was around. So those senior leadership roles closer to the muster room floor as just another safeguard measure so we can address behaviour there and then if it's needed.
Now, Her Honour's asked you about issues to do with respect. The respect, equity and diversity policy, you describe in paragraph 75 as having been reviewed and updated.
Yes.
Has that been in part as a consequence of what has been revealed in the course of this inquest?
Partly, Your Honour, yes, but I think it's, again, contemporary, modern and appropriate for every police force to take those as absolute fundamental values that we need to drive, not just this inquest.
And in paragraph 10, you describe the Human Resources and Wellbeing section as having conducted a series of workshops in relation to respectful workplace behaviour.
Correct.
And finally, you describe an issue which Mr Porter, after you can develop further in terms of robust action being taken against a series of individuals in recent times where racism appears to have been at least a component of their unacceptable behaviour.
Yes.
Now, one of the ways perhaps to reduce racism is to have more Indigenous persons working within the force and participating at every level in policing in the Northern Territory. Is that right?
Yes, Your Honour.
Now, I'm just going to take you through this reasonably briefly, but in paragraph 80 and following, you outline the role of ACPOs, police auxiliaries and Aboriginal liaison officers. Is that right?
Correct.
And you identified that ACPOs in paragraph 83 have to do a course of 24 weeks, whereas in fact the constable course is only a little bit longer. Is that so?
That's correct, Your Honour.
On graduating from the course, they're a probationary ACPO, and then they have to fulfil other requirements to become a substantive ACPO. And there's the potential for them in 86 to graduate to ACPO first class, second class, and then senior ACPO, like Derek Williams, for instance.
That's correct.
And there's the potential for transition to constable.
That's correct.
From being ACPO. Now, there's a review you describe in paragraph 87 to facilitate those processes. Can you say just a little bit more about the framework and what's being done in that regard?
Again, I think, Your Honour, in simplicity, it's an intent to streamline our processes so we can make the transition much more efficient and effective, to allow a progression pathway between the two identified positions.
You identified the numbers. Just say a little bit more of ACPOs. Can you say a bit more to Her Honour about those? And you described those in paragraph 90.
Your Honour, it just talked about numbers there in terms of we have 61 ACPO positions across the Northern Territory Police Force, 1,378 sworn members, at least on the date that I signed this affidavit, 108 of which were Aboriginal. So it just talks about Northern Territory Police Force currently have about 11.4 or 11% of its workforce identifies as Aboriginal.
What's the plan in terms of trying to recruit more persons as ACPOs and then in due course as constables? We'll come to ALOs in a minute.
We're actively trying to pursue additional and more ACPO recruitment. That's ongoing.
You described the role of police auxiliaries. We'll pass over those, but there are 234 of them, you say, in paragraph 94, a number of whom identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Let's go to Aboriginal liaison officers, ALOs. You say that in paragraph 98 there are approximately 50 of them. I told Her Honour yesterday that there were 2 in Largemanu. I think that's right, isn't it?
Correct.
Paragraph 98. And one can see in that table in paragraph 98, that currently there are 3 in Yuendamu. I think there have been more a little while ago. It's a fluid process, is that right?
That's correct, Your Honour, and from time to time people transition out of those roles.
What's the intention in terms of numbers of ALOs, recognising that the ALO is actually quite a new phenomenon? Northern Territory Police Force.
Northern Territory Police Force intent, Your Honour, is we wish to recruit at a minimum another 30, hopefully considerable more than that, and futuristically anticipating that the ALO program could provide a great pathway, promotional pathway or recruitment pathway into the sworn ranks of the Northern Territory Police Force and beyond.
Have you had anyone move from ALO to a substantive position? Other position?
Mr. Porter may be able to provide me that by tomorrow, Your Honour. I suspect there might be. Certainly, I do know that we have lost a number of our ALOs to other government agencies, unfortunately.
In answer to Your Honour's question, paragraph 27, Your Honour, got that. The route is generally ALO to ACPO and then ACPO through the ranks up to constable, and you can see there that 2 former ALOs have gone on to be ACPOs. Others have indicated interest in the process. Now, given we can see therefore that there are considerable numbers of ACPOs and ALOs in the police force, with the aspiration that there be more as soon as that can be organised. 61 odd, I'll put that dumb way, 61 ACPOs and 50 ALOs. That's now, as you've said to Her Honour, a significant component of the force. We've heard evidence that these people have been distressed by the revelation of these text messages from their constable colleagues.
Yes.
As these numbers increase, what impact do you think that is likely to have on the acceptability of racist and similar attitudes within your force?
Well, it's our absolute hope and part of the strategy that it will minimise that, and hopefully that those members who may be ignorant, if that's a word I'm even going to use, would be working with people who demonstrate that that's not the case, that they'd call it out, they'd see it. I mean, I heard the evidence of one of the most compelling witness, ma'am, was Bradley Wallace, in and of himself, heartbroken at working with some of these people and then reading and hearing about these text messages that he's of people he works with. So, again, I don't know how to couch an answer. I'm challenged by what happened and what transpired.
Okay. Your Honour, would this be a convenient time for a short break? I'm going to move to a different topic.
Small Patch, would you